Let's think for a moment about Girls on Fire as a part of girls' culture. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about my previous research that was published in my first book, Pictures of Girlhood, Modern Female Adolescence on Film, and I'm going to use that in a way to frame YA dystopia in thinking about, again, modern female adolescence, but rather than just on film, in this larger genre of YA dystopia and the films made from it. First, we might think about this category of girl. Anita Harris argues that the category of girl is constantly shifting and cannot be linked to a fixed age or developmental stage in life. Even though we tend to use this term to talk about a girl of a certain age, that term girl really shifts across a variety of different connotations and spaces. So when we talk about the girl on fire is a particular kind of girl. She shifts and occupies between spaces. She's a girl with responsibilities, and she's a girl of a certain age and a certain stage that links to girls and women of other ages and stages. So in other words, the stories in YA dystopia that we hear might be appealing to girls that are younger than the characters as well as girls who are older than the characters. Two of the kind of foundational ideas in girl studies are girl power and reviving Ophelia. So girl studies was really formed in the 1990s as a tangent off of women's studies, as women's studies was not considering age as an important vector. So these two ideas about girlhood are parallel and opposite in a lot of ways. So we have the idea of girl power, which became very popular in t-shirts and different slogans, but really derived from the Riot Girls or the You Go Girl of the 1990s and the most popular incarnation of the Spice Girls, who really made girl power popular in the mainstream. And this is this idea of the new girl. She's assertive, she's dynamic, she's unbound. Girl power seeks to empower girls to make choices and pursue power and then also empowerment. On the other hand, we have Reviving Ophelia, which comes from the very famous book and study by Mary Pfeiffer, Reviving Ophelia. And this looks at girls as being vulnerable, voiceless, and fragile. Reviving Ophelia seeks to save the selves of adolescent girls and to empower them, but it looks at our culture as a girl-poisoning culture, and it looks at the ways in which girls' voices go away around adolescence. So these two, again, kind of parallel but opposite ideas are really what frame a lot of girl studies. Girl power tends to overemphasize the individual's power, and Reviving Ophelia tends to underestimate girls' abilities. So when we talk about Girls on Fire, I think they're really between these two strands. So let's look a little bit at constructing social norms and mainstream spaces. So one of the arguments that I make in my first book, Pictures of Girlhood, what we know or what we think we know about things like adolescence, coming of age, economics, race, gender, sexuality, really anything in our culture, is filtered through and formed by the stories that we see in film and in popular culture more generally. If we think about mainstream spaces and girl spaces, we can see that mainstream narratives create the world that we inhabit and negotiate. Mainstream spaces create a certain kind of world with certain kinds of girls, and we're going to look more closely at that in just a second. Michelle Fine, in the foreword to a book called All About the Girl, describes spaces where women and girls gather as girls and women, where we create a world. I like to think about this in terms of YA dystopia authors also who create a world where girls navigate without power, or sometimes with power. But our authors also create girls on fire who challenge and even change the worlds they did not create. And in community, they create new worlds. In Pictures of Girlhood, I think of this concept of girls' film and this space, this girls' space. I look at a variety of different films across genres and a variety of different categories, mostly films that focus on a female protagonist and a coming-of-age story. So they cross comedy, drama, horror, and family films. They're both mainstream and independent films. They're films about girls and films about women. There's a mixture of submission to norms and subversion of norms, and there's really a spectrum of girls, a spectrum of issues, and a spectrum of that, again, submission to the norms of our culture and the pushing back against those norms as well. This book, and generally YA dystopia as well, it's not about what's good or bad, what we like or what we don't like, but really we consider patterns and trends, interpretations, applications, considering this body of films and how it creates and maybe even recreates our worlds. So let's think a little bit about constructing mainstream worlds. And again, here I'm pulling from pictures of Girlhood and looking at really girls' films from the 1990s and 2000s as they meet YA dystopia from the 2000s and 2010s. So what do we know of girls in mainstream America? And this is really a brief list of the films that I talk about, these mainstream films. And at a variety of different talks, I usually pull out this list of films and I ask people to raise their hand if they've seen or heard of these films. And generally, everyone in the room has seen almost all of these films, or at least knows about these films and can speak to what they say about girls. I've added this little aspect here about YA dystopia because certainly in terms of YA dystopia, the girls that we see and we know of in mainstream America are certainly Katniss and Triss, and they really are the face of Girls on Fire in film right now. I'll also note that mainstream films often sacrifice the complexity of the books that they're based upon, and I think this is especially true for the Hunger Games series. I'm a little up in the air in terms of Divergent. I don't know that it's that much more rich and complicated than what the film gives us. But the Hunger Games and Catching Fire, watching these films, especially after rereading the books, it's almost depressing because it's like they've sucked the soul out of the books. They've sucked away Katniss's voice, and the film is a very different experience than reading the books. So in mainstreams, generally, roles are often relying upon stereotypes like the dumb blondes or the black girls with attitude, a polarization between good girls and bad girls, or virgins and whores. But the protagonist might be considered a quote-unquote all-American girl. She's a girl that the mainstream audience can identify with, particularly after she comes of age and becomes a better person than perhaps she was when the film began. Most of the protagonists in these films are upper-class, white teens, and usually popular stars, but in these films race is rarely discussed. And so on this slide here we can just get a sense here, and on the left here are some of the stars of these teen films of the 90s and 2000s, and again I've selected pictures that are a little bit monotonous, but we see that same look in the girls in these films. And then we have these newer films of the Hunger Games and Divergent, and we see that the stars that are performing in these films look exactly like these other girls. And of course they look different when they play their characters, but again part of the idea is that we really see the same image of girls over and over and over again, particularly in that protagonist role. So whiteness in these films is invisible and yet it's centered. And so I just like this picture representation from Save the Last Dance because we can see, like, here's Sarah and she's dancing with Derek on the dance floor, and she is literally surrounded by all of the teens of color who are cheering her on. So really a literal kind of picture of what I'm talking about. So a little detour here to look at whiteness a little bit more closely. So from an article by France Windus Twine, she talks about whiteness and the social construction of whiteness. And so these are a few of the things that she says about whiteness. That whiteness is a position of racial neutrality. Whiteness is a position of middle-class privilege, or rather these are the different ways that whiteness might function. White as an identity, as an expression and embodiment of individualism, and white identity as a kind of comfort zone. So in other words, whiteness is a norm, and it might also be an assumption of privilege. White consciousness draws from these ideas of whiteness. So white privileges individualism and racial neutrality. So, in other words, and particularly as it relates to YA dystopia, white is a way of creating characters that are quote-unquote racially neutral, but act, talk, and look white, and often lack connections to ethnic origins, contextual or historical. White is also a way of creating a quote-unquote American girl. White is a way of imagining mainstream American dystopias and utopias that don't carry the 20th or 21st century concerns related to race, ethnicity, nationality, or religion. So of course we'll talk a lot more about these different aspects throughout our class. but it's something to think about in terms of how these girls are constructed and what that lack of discussion of race or that discussion of race means, and especially as it's repeated and reiterated in popular culture. And this is just one of my favorite memes here that relates back to Mean Girls. If you're from Pan Am, why aren't you white? And of course, that is looking at the line, if you're from Africa, then why are you white? Which she says. In these films, teens of color, gay teens, and lower class teens rarely appear. And this is a little bit different for YA dystopia, in part because we see a lot of the girls in these books are coming from lower class origins, or survival kinds of situations, and that's particular to the genre. But generally, this also continues to hold true. So in these girls' films, we see teens of color or gay teens or lower class teens being token characters or stereotypes or foils or bit characters. And these are just examples from 10 Things I Hate About You, Mean Girls, Bring It On, where Isis is literally the only black character in the film who has a name. And then we have, the more recent iterations where we see race coming into play a little bit more in these films. But then we have, for instance, Rue here, and there's a lot of controversy over the casting decision to make her a black girl. So these conversations continue in and out of popular culture, and again, we just see this marginalization of characters who are other than white and privileged. Romance, of course, is a big theme in all of these films, as well as in our YA dystopia books. In these films, we get really a kind of love conquers all message a lot of times. We see that a girl's happiness is often contingent upon a boy or a man. There's almost always happy, norm-enforcing endings to these films, and one of the best ones is like Clueless, where it literally ends where they're all at a wedding and all talking about their weddings, or Save the Last Dance, where Derek busts into the auditorium and gives Sarah a pep talk so that she can then do her dance to get her into Juilliard. In these films, sex often takes place off-screen or post-narrative and is often romantically portrayed, but there's really not a whole lot of sex in these films or in the books that we're talking about either. And in the films, in particular in pop culture, as of late, love triangles, of course, are all the rage, even though the romance theme in Hunger Games is highly contested, and a lot of us would argue, myself included, that there's really not a love triangle so much in the book, but that in popular culture it plays up that aspect because of the whole love triangle in Twilight. But I've added a couple of images here to kind of speak to that love triangle in popular culture. I'll also note that very few YA dystopia books include sex. Some of them do, but almost all include a kiss and oftentimes feelings that are kind of unexpected, so to speak. So again, those are all aspects of mainstream films, and again, they're generalizations, but I think the more you think about it, the more you'll see that that's true, not only of the films that I'm talking about, but really of mainstream popular culture more generally. So how about other worlds? How about the films that don't play into those same kinds of stereotypes? What girls do we see less of in mainstream America? So like I said before, when I run through that list of films, most people have seen all of the mainstream films, and most people have seen maybe one or two films on this list. So take a moment and see if you've seen the films on this list, and maybe think about how our perception of American girls is really shaped by these films that are so popular in mainstream culture. The girls we see less of in mainstream America, I don't think we'll be seeing films made of any of these books anytime soon. I hope I'm wrong. In these independent films and less well-known films, many times they are written, directed, and produced by women. So here we have from Debs and Just Another Girl on the IRT. And here we have Tamara Jenkins, I think her name is, from Slums of Beverly Hills. So a lot of these women are writing films and producing and directing those films based upon their own experiences Or like in the case of Deb's, not based on her experience, but creating this fictional world where girls can play and have fun. And then we have Sherry Smith, who wrote Orleans, and Marie Lu, who wrote Legend. So in fact, YA dystopia with female protagonists are almost exclusively written by women. The only exception that comes to my mind immediately is the Partials series, which is also very interesting because he dedicates the series and the fact that he has created those female protagonists to his daughters, which is pretty cool. And also interesting to note that this is not the case for YA dystopia featuring male characters. There's actually quite a few women who write YA dystopia books that feature male characters, including, for instance, The Giver. Girls in these films are in the girls in starring roles are more diverse, and issues related to race are more complex. So we have a lot more discussion and portrayal of race and class issues. We have sexual orientation that is not heteronormativity. We also have less well-known actors often playing the role in these films. So just a little sampling, we have Whale Rider, we have Slums of Beverly Hills. Natasha Lyonne has become more popular, and she had a role in American Pie, for instance. We have America Ferrera, and a very little known film called Girls Town, which I think is like the quintessential girls film, and it's a really awesome film if you're able to take a look at that. In Shadows Cast by Stars, we see indigenous heritage of our protagonist coming into play. And in Tankborn, we have, even on the cover, we can see that she's definitely a non-white girl. And this one's actually set in kind of a dystopic India. So different kinds of settings, different kinds of girls, more complex roles and issues. We also have more diverse sexuality, as I mentioned before, and more complex friendships. So it's not the kind of sidekick that we see in a lot of the mainstream kind of films. Like we have girls having real relationships with other girls, whether they're romantic or not. And so again, we have a sampling here. We see Debs and we see the kind of visual diversity of those girls, but then they also have a lot of different characteristics that they play through. All Over Me, kind of a classic early lesbian film here from Foxfire, one of Angelina Jolie's first films, The Girls Who Run with the Wolves. The Incredibly True Adventures of Two Girls in Love, which you can just imagine what that film is about. It is one of the few actual interracial relationships in girls' film. Manny and Lo, one of Scarlett Johansson's first films. It's a pair of sisters and the adventures that they get into. And Show Me Love, which is actually a Swedish film, which is a really great film about early love. And then, of course, The Summer Prince, which actually has masturbation and polyamory and all sorts of really cool alternative sexualities. And then Orleans, where we have the character who, she doesn't have a love interest in the film. She has a kind of a friendship with the stranger, the tourist, Daniel. In these films, girls confront stereotypes and victimhood. And so here we see from But I'm a Cheerleader, and this is a really funny set of scenes where they're really playing with those gender stereotypes. From Girls Town here we see Richard Helms here, who's on the ground, raped one of their friends who later committed suicide, and they confront him about it and literally beat him up very visually, or very openly on the street. So it's a way of dealing with that violence that he had done to their friend in a very public way, since they know that the law is not going to take care of it. And interestingly, even though I would really place Hunger Games and Divergent into the mainstream category, we see a lot of blurring, which I'll get to a little bit later. So we do see that actually the girls in these films do confront stereotypes and victimhood. That's really what the Hunger Games is all about with Katniss. And then here in this scene from Divergent, we have Triss, who's a stiff. She's from Abnegation, and she's the first one of the initiates to jump off of the roof because she's brave enough to do that. So she really fights those stereotypes of where she comes from. So we see girls really challenging, again, stereotypes and victimhood, and becoming empowered and doing things that help them to grow. So girls' film really can create these other kinds of worlds. There's more complicated issues. There's not always easy answers or happy endings. In a lot of these films and books, girls narrate. They tell their own stories. In the films, they often use "quote unquote" attitude as a voice and as power, and we see that happening sometimes in the YA dystopia books as well. Girls also take control of their sexuality. It's a lot more active and not acted upon. Sex is often on screen and it's not often romantic. And sometimes in these films and in these books, sometimes sex is a form of pleasure that may be solo or may be shared. And again, those are the more kind of radical books. And of course, then we also have, the way of confronting that love triangle, Team Peeta or Team Gale. Well, you see the answer right there. So one of the arguments that I make in Pictures of Girlhood is perhaps a optimistic and romanticized argument, but I stand by it. And that's that in better understanding this terrain of girls' film, or I would extend that now to this terrain of YA dystopia with female protagonists, we might better understand ourselves, and in better understanding ourselves, we might better understand how we can work to change the structures that define and confine us, not only for ourselves, but for others as well. Other worlds, other perspectives, and other experiences perhaps reshape the mainstream, and we can already see that happening in the past, and I think that will continue in the present and in the future. So this terrain of YA dystopia is perhaps even richer and more relevant to challenging and changing norms through social justice and empowerment. Again, optimistic? Realistic? You can figure it out. So back to the charts that I had shared earlier, the Girl on Fire in terms of identity and character, there's a lot of overlap with the girls that we see in girls' films. Again, these are female protagonists who take on roles that are often reserved for boys. They often tell their own story, often again in the I, or the omniscient kind of narrator. Their age is usually 16, 17, maybe 15, 18, but we get a lot of flashbacks in these stories that portray events from girlhood. Like I mentioned, often lower socioeconomic class or living in survival mode. This is definitely not always the case. It's not the case in Legend. It's not the case in The Summer Prince. Still, we see overwhelming heterosexuality, heteronormativity, non-heterosexual orientation, or even just a lack of a male love interest, or even a love triangle is rare. We even see love squares or rectangles. And again, romance continues to be a frequent theme. We also see some interesting aspects in terms of ability in these books because a lot of times the girls maybe have special abilities and skills, but we also see able bodies and sound minds that are challenged and sometimes compromised, particularly by that corrupt power. So in terms of race, we see that kind of mainstream girl who's described or assumed as white, but may reflect a future of racial ambiguities, like Katniss. The female protagonist is often an outsider or an outcast of some kind when the book begins. And then we have a set of books that we're considering in our Girls on Fire class, where the girls are definitely non-white, and I'm putting them in the other girl category, and their racial identity is really established by anything from their name, their skin color, hair texture, ancestry or parentage, ethnic group, or a combination of these, but most importantly, race is overtly discussed. So in pretty much all of the mainstream books, race really is not discussed or is not an issue. And again, there are some exceptions to that, including, for instance, Legend, which I think will become more of a mainstream book as the film is made a reality, and we do see some discussion of race in that book. And that context, of course, of Girls on Fire and YA dystopia is quite different than the context that we see in terms of Pictures of Girlhood. And the films that I talk about in Pictures of Girlhood from the 90s and early 2000s, they're sometimes set in the past, but they're often contemporary stories, and really don't change that much in terms of their setting. But we see, again, that dystopian context and everything that it holds. So, the 1990s saw an explosion of girls' films, similar to the contemporary explosion of YA literature generally and YA dystopia specifically. These films certainly made room for more stories about girls, more girls' spaces, and more blurring of the lines between mainstream and other. Girls and women have gained more agency in films and in books and in the real world as well, but there's still more work to be done.